Take a look at this picture. Mighty walls, tall towers, impregnable gates, a medieval castle, a symbol of power and grandeur. We are used to seeing it in movies and books as a place of nightly tournaments and lavish feasts. But what if I told you that behind these walls lies something else? Something much harsher and darker, especially during the cold season. Winter in a castle was not just an inconvenience. It was a constant struggle for survival. A struggle against the cold, hunger, and dampness. And how people coped with this remains largely a mystery. Watch the video to the end to find out how people survived the winter in medieval castles and how many did not. When we imagine a castle, the first thing that comes to mind is huge fireplaces. And indeed, there were fireplaces, and there were many of them. They were located in the staterooms and in the feudal lord's chambers. But let's look at it from another angle. A castle is essentially a huge stone box. Stone walls do not retain heat, they give it away. Of course, it was warm inside the room, but only in the immediate vicinity of the fire, from the fireplace, stove, or brazier. And what was beyond that? The rest of the room remained cold. You could sit by the fireplace and feel its heat, but if you moved a couple of meters away, you would immediately feel the temperature drop sharply. At the same time, imagine that the fireplace is not a sealed system. In addition to smoke, all the heat that managed to appear escaped through it. You heat the room, but the castle remains cold. How warm do you think it was in such conditions, when the temperature in the center of the huge hall barely rose above 10 degrees? Write your guesses in the comments. And there is another aspect, fuel. In order to keep the fire going in huge fireplaces, an incredible amount of firewood was required. Castles were often built in wooded areas, but even then, harvesting, transporting, and storing such a large amount of wood was a colossal task. People had to be sent to the forest constantly to chop down trees, saw them, drag them to the castle, and then store them. It was one of the most labor-intensive and dangerous jobs. In addition, the wood had to be dry, which was not easy in the damp atmosphere of the castle. Damp wood produced little heat and a lot of smoke, making the air inside the rooms even more stifling. Sometimes peat, coal, or even charcoal were used for heating, but these were also expensive and not always available. Thus, even if there were many fireplaces in the castle, it was unrealistic to keep them burning constantly to maintain the temperature. Most of the time, fires were only lit in the rooms where the feudal lord himself was present, and then more to create the appearance of warmth and comfort than for actual heating. The rest of the castle's inhabitants, including servants and soldiers, lived in conditions where the indoor temperature was almost the same as the outdoor temperature. The inefficiency of fireplaces was due to their design. Wide chimneys were necessary to provide draft for the massive hearths, but most of the heat escaped through them. As a result, despite the constant fire, cold air circulated in the rooms and smoke often filled the halls, causing stinging eyes and difficulty breathing. People of low social status had no access to fireplaces at all and huddled in cold, damp rooms where the only source of heat was a fire in the common hall or a hearth in the workshop. The cold, which penetrated through cracks in the walls and small window openings, was a constant companion of the castle's inhabitants. As a result, people often suffered from rheumatism, arthritis, and other illnesses associated with hypothermia. Heat was not just a comfort, but a privilege, a status symbol that was available only to a few. Castle owners and their families could afford to heat their fireplaces, but even they could not escape the pervasive cold that permeated the stone and air, making winter a real test of endurance. Fireplaces were, in essence, merely a status symbol rather than an effective heating device. To combat the constant cold, noble families used heavy tapestries and carpets to cover the walls to insulate the room from the icy stone. The floor was covered with straw or reeds, which also helped to reduce heat loss and muffle footsteps. For local heating, braziers were used, metal bowls with burning coals that could be carried from room to room. This was very dangerous due to the risk of fire and carbon monoxide poisoning. But in cold conditions, people were willing to take such risks. The constant work of gathering firewood and maintaining the fire fell on the shoulders of the servants, for whom it was exhausting labor. As a result, despite all efforts, Castles remained cold, damp, and dark places where even the most distinguished people could not enjoy real comfort. Winter was a time of survival, not idle entertainment. Food is energy. It is what helps us stay warm. In winter, when the gardens are covered with snow and livestock, if any, requires enormous amounts of feed, the main diet consisted of what had been harvested in summer and autumn. Grain, dried meat, salted fish, root vegetables. All of this was stored in basements and pantries. Sounds good, but there is one caveat. The cellars were essentially part of the castle, and they were also made of stone and damp. Therefore, it was very difficult to keep supplies safe and sound. Food often spoiled and became moldy, and in order not to go hungry, people had to eat food that was not always fresh. Imagine eating meat that was salted several months ago and no longer looks like it was just cooked. And it wasn't a matter of choice, it was a matter of survival. Even with such supplies, winter was usually difficult, and the diet was very meager. And in the spring, when the supplies were running low, the so-called hungry season began, when people ate whatever they could find in the forest. Where did they get the food for the huge castle feasts that are so often written about? The grain stored in the cellars often fell victim to rodents and mold. To protect it from spoiling, people dried it in the sun. But even that did not always help. And in the constant dampness of the castle, even dried grain quickly lost its properties. Salted meat and fish were also not an ideal solution. Salt, of course, helped to preserve them, but it made the food very salty, which required a lot of water to drink, and water, as we already know, was in short supply. In addition, such meat was very tough and tasteless. To cook it in any way, it had to be boiled for a long time, which again required a lot of fuel. Of the vegetables and fruits, only root vegetables usually remained: turnips, carrots, onions, and garlic. But even they did not always survive until spring. Therefore, the main diet consisted of bread, porridge, soups made from dried vegetables, and, if you were lucky, a small piece of salted meat or fish. Imagine eating the same thing day after day, month after month. In the spring, when supplies ran out, people switched to more exotic foods such as wild herbs, roots, berries, and sometimes even tree bark. But even in such conditions, they had to work. How could they do this when it was pitch dark and there was no electricity? Watch the video to the end to find out the answer to this question. The winter feasts that are often talked about were rare exceptions rather than the norm. They were held on special occasions when fresh supplies were available, such as after a successful hunt or the collection of tribute. However, most of the meat served was not fresh but smoked, dried, or salted. To mask the specific taste of old meat, it was generously seasoned with spices, which were incredibly expensive and available only to the nobility. It was not just a matter of taste, but a demonstration of wealth. Servants and soldiers received the cheapest and least tasty parts: porridge made from grains, dried beans, and moldy bread, which, in order not to be thrown away, was soaked in water or wine. A lack of vitamins and nutrients led to scurvy, anemia, and other diseases. It was not always clear how safe food was, but hunger was stronger than fear, and people ate whatever they could, even if it meant risking poisoning. The interior rooms of the castle, where food was stored, were an ideal breeding ground for rats and mice, which not only destroyed supplies, but also carried dangerous diseases. Grain stores, known as barns, were located in separate buildings, but even they did not protect against rodents and mold. Meat and fish were preserved by salting them in barrels or smoking them over a fire, but this made them very tough and salty. Cooking such food required long boiling, which was inefficient. The lack of fresh fruit and vegetables for several months led to severe vitamin deficiencies, primarily scurvy, which manifested itself in bleeding gums, tooth loss, and general weakness. Hunting was particularly difficult in winter, but sometimes it was possible to catch a hare, deer, or wild boar. However, this fresh game was almost entirely reserved for the feudal lord's table. The servants and soldiers had to make do with the meager food they were given, and in the spring, when supplies were running low, hard times set in. People ate wild herbs, roots, and berries that they could find in the forest. The sun is a rare visitor in winter, and when it does appear, it sets very quickly. The days become short and the nights long. In the castle, where the windows were small and did not have the glass we are used to, there was very little light. Artificial lighting consisted of candles and torches. Candles were expensive and made from animal fat. They smoked heavily and gave off little light. Torches were even more smoky and dangerous. Therefore, people spent most of their time in semi-darkness. Imagine a huge hall with 10 people sitting in it. Everyone is busy with their own business, but they cannot just walk over and light a candle. It was a privilege. Candles and torches were mainly used in formal rooms, while in the rest of the house, in the servants' quarters and barracks, people made do with the little light that filtered through narrow windows or reflected off the fire. This affected all aspects of life, from work to leisure. Even reading, if it was available, became a real problem. Speaking of candles, it took a large amount of fat to make one, which was not easy to come by. Therefore, candles were very expensive and were used sparingly. Even a feudal lord could not afford to light his entire castle. Torches burning on the walls provided the main source of light. However, they were not only a source of light, but also of smoke. The castle walls were usually covered in soot, and the air was heavy and stale. This caused headaches, breathing problems, and of course, impaired vision. The long winter nights in the castle were a real test. People went to bed very early, as it was impossible to do anything in the dark. They woke up when it was already light outside. Thus, in winter, people spent most of their lives in bed. This, of course, did not help them stay in good physical shape. The narrow windows, which served as defenses, were another problem. They let in little light but allowed cold air to enter. Therefore, the rooms were very cold. It was not always possible to cover them with fabrics, as this made access to light even more difficult. The ordinary inhabitants of the castle, who did not belong to the nobility, had to make do with even more primitive sources of light, such as fat lamps. These were bowls filled with animal fat or vegetable oil, into which a wick was dipped. They gave off even less light than candles and produced an unpleasant smell, but they were cheaper. The constant semi-darkness and dim light affected not only people's eyesight, but also their mental state. Long, dark nights contributed to the development of melancholy and depression. The lack of light limited social contact and made life monotonous. Evenings were spent gathered around the only source of light, which brought people together, but at the same time limited their personal space. In the servants' quarters, where there were no lamps, people spent their nights in complete darkness. The only light they could see was the moonlight shining through narrow slit windows. In such conditions, even the simplest tasks, such as mending clothes, became a real challenge. Another problem was the windows, which were not made of glass but of thin sheets of oiled cloth or bull's bladder. They let in very little light but provided good protection from wind and rain. The interior of the castle was plunged into deep darkness by midday. The halls, lit only by the dim light of torches, were full of moving shadows, creating an eerie and mysterious atmosphere. The castle's master candle makers were highly respected, as their work was vital to the functioning of the castle. Beeswax candles were even more expensive and were used only on the most solemn occasions. Most of the time, life in the castle was completely governed by the sundial. People woke up at dawn and went to bed when it got dark, as it was impossible to do any work without light. This affected the entire daily routine, and the winter months were a time when most of life was spent waiting for morning to come. We tend to think that people in the Middle Ages did not care much about hygiene, but this is not true. They knew about cleanliness, but in winter, everything was more complicated. Imagine there is no running water in the castle. All the water needed for household needs, for cooking, for washing, was brought in buckets from a well or the nearest source. And in winter, this water froze. The wells froze over and the ice had to be broken. And if the water needed to be heated, that required even more fuel. Therefore, people rarely washed. The clothes worn in castles were multi-layered to keep warm. They were made of wool and linen, but even such clothes did not protect against the dampness that permeated the walls. And when a person wore the same clothes for a long time, the smell became quite distinctive. At the same time, washing clothes was very difficult due to the lack of hot water. Therefore, they were simply aired out, beaten, and washed only in very rare cases. And of course, wearing the same clothes for months led to very unpleasant consequences. Imagine that you cannot wash properly for months, Would you be able to sleep when you smell so bad that you can touch it? We will tell you about this and much more. Layering was not only a fashion statement, but also a necessity. A linen shirt was worn next to the skin to absorb sweat and protect against the rough wool. Woolen tunics, cloaks, and capes were worn over the top. All of these garments were heavy and did not dry well. Washing, if it happened at all, was a laborious process requiring huge amounts of water and fuel. Clothes were soaked in lye made from wood ash and then beaten on stones, which required physical strength. Therefore, clothes were only washed in extreme cases. With constant wear, clothes became a breeding ground for parasites. In some castles, there were special combs, which were one of the few personal hygiene tools available. Even servants, who regularly came into contact with water, were unable to wash frequently. Their main method of hygiene was to wipe themselves with damp cloths and air their clothes in the cold, which of course could not replace proper washing and bathing. Dampness and unsanitary conditions led to skin diseases and infections. Wool, which was the main material for warm clothing, was very coarse and prickly, causing skin irritation. Linen, which was worn under the wool, was softer but not very warm. Clothes worn in castles were often impregnated with the smell of smoke, sweat, and dampness, which was an integral part of the castle atmosphere. To mask the odors, dried herbs were sewn into clothing, or aromatic oils were used. However, this was only available to the nobility. Hygiene was a problem not only for the body, but also for clothing. With constant wear, it quickly became dirty, but washing it was almost impossible. Therefore, clothes were simply beaten, shaken out, and aired, which of course did not help against parasites. Because of this, many people suffered from skin diseases, which were very dangerous in the absence of medicine. Clothes that protected against the cold were also a source of problems. Sometimes special baths were built in castles, but this was rare and a luxury available only to the most noble people. Most often, a basin of hot water was used as a bath. As for the simpler inhabitants of the castle, they washed themselves with buckets of water. At the same time, as I have already mentioned, water was in short supply. And every time you needed to wash, it became a whole operation. But even if there was water, imagine, you are in a huge cold room where the temperature is barely above zero. You undress to wash and all the hot water in the basin immediately cools down. This process did more harm than good. The dampness that permeated everything contributed to the spread of various diseases, and it was very difficult to escape them. Another important point to consider is that the water used for washing was often dirty. It was taken from wells or rivers, which could be contaminated. And of course, no one thought about boiling or filtering the water. Therefore, even if washing took place, it was not always safe. In addition, castles did not have soap as we know it today. People used ash or lye, which of course did not have the same cleansing properties as modern soap. And of course, the lack of hot water was the biggest problem. It was very difficult to heat large amounts of water. This required a huge boiler, which had to be placed on a fire, and this again required a lot of fuel. Therefore, people washed rarely, and this was one of the factors that contributed to the spread of disease. In such conditions, even a simple cold could have serious consequences. People were forced to live in constant dampness and cold, and this, of course, affected their health. Baths, if they existed at all, were wooden barrels set up in warm rooms, often next to a fireplace. It was a whole event that people prepared for in advance. Water was heated in large boilers and was only available to a select few. For the nobility, washing could be a social event where guests were invited and entertained with music. However, even in such conditions, the water cooled quickly, and the cold air quickly negated all efforts. For most of the castle's inhabitants, washing was a harsh necessity, not a pleasure. Aromatic herbs were used to mask the unpleasant smell, but this was only a temporary measure. The lack of proper hygiene meant that skin diseases and infections were common. Because of this, even a small wound could lead to serious inflammation and gangrene, which in the absence of antibiotics often ended in death. In such conditions, people learned to adapt, but it was a life on the brink of survival, where even simple things like washing became a huge problem. The invention of soap was known since ancient times, but in the Middle Ages, its production was an expensive and labor-intensive process. It was made from animal fats, lye, and ash. but it did not have the same cleansing properties as modern soap. Many people believed that washing with hot water was dangerous because it opened the pores and made a person vulnerable to disease. Therefore, even noble people washed very rarely, preferring to wipe themselves with damp towels soaked in aromatic oils and herbs. In essence, hygiene was more like perfumery than cleansing. At the same time, washing was an important social ritual that demonstrated status and wealth. But even in the most luxurious baths, it was difficult to keep warm, as the water in the barrel cooled quickly. This led to people getting sick, and in the absence of medicine, even a simple cold could lead to death. Beds in medieval castles were large and had canopies. Canopies were not just decoration, they served to retain heat in some way. The stone walls were very cold, and to avoid freezing in their sleep, people slept in large beds with canopies so that the heat they gave off would not escape. The beds were usually covered with fur blankets and woolen quilts, but even with such protection, it was very cold. To keep warm, people slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, and sometimes even in their shoes. Before going to bed, they used so-called warmers, small bowls with hot coals that were placed in the bed. But this was dangerous, as it was easy to get burned. Therefore, sleeping in a castle was a real challenge. Imagine having to sleep in a room where the temperature is below zero. Do you think the servants slept in such luxurious beds? We will debunk this myth later. Canopies did play an important role in keeping the heat in. They created a kind of room within a room, protecting sleepers from drafts and cold stone walls. These canopies were often made of heavy, thick fabrics to insulate the sleeping area as much as possible. People slept under them not alone, but in families and sometimes with servants to keep warm. For servants, soldiers, and other castle staff, the luxury of canopy beds was not available. They slept on straw mattresses that lay directly on the floor, often in common rooms where dozens of people slept. These mattresses were a breeding ground for lice, bed bugs, and fleas, and had to be changed regularly. Clay pots with hot coals were also used for warmth, which were placed under blankets, which was very dangerous due to the risk of fire and carbon monoxide poisoning. Sleep in such conditions was restless, and people often woke up from the cold or discomfort. Even in the most luxurious rooms, despite all efforts, the air was cold and damp. The beds of the nobility were filled with down and feathers, but for the servants, this was an impossible dream. They slept on hard straw mattresses, which also had to be changed regularly to avoid the accumulation of parasites. At night, the castle was filled with sounds. The whistling of the wind in the cracks, the banging of shutters, the rustling of rodents in the walls. All these sounds made it difficult to sleep and made the night even more restless. Sleeping in the same clothes as during the day was common practice, as it added an extra layer of insulation. Stone or clay tiles, which were heated over a fire and wrapped in cloth, were often used as additional warmers. This was safer than burning coals, but no less dangerous. Sleeping in the castle was not rest, but another ordeal. When a blizzard rages outside and the temperature drops, it is impossible to spend time outdoors. In the castle, the main entertainment was board games, reading, if available, and of course, conversation. The huge halls of the castle, where there were fireplaces, became the center of social life. All the inhabitants of the castle gathered there to listen to stories, exchange news, and play games. Checkers, chess, and dice were popular. Also, if there was a minstrel in the castle, he could entertain people with his songs and stories. All this helped to brighten up the long winter evenings. But of course, all these entertainments were only available to the nobility. Servants and soldiers were deprived of such luxuries. After a long day of work, they simply went to bed to gather strength for the next day. They had neither the time nor the energy, nor, of course, the place for entertainment. Their leisure time consisted of the simplest things: conversations, storytelling, and perhaps some simple games they could come up with themselves. There were no books in the castle, and even if there had been, it would have been impossible to read in the dim light. Therefore, the main form of entertainment was oral tradition. People told each other fairy tales, legends, and stories about their ancestors. This was a very important aspect of their lives. It helped them stay connected with each other and feel part of the community. It also helped them forget about the cold, hunger, and other hardships they faced every day. And of course, very often these stories were not just entertainment, but a way of passing on knowledge, traditions, and experience. For the nobility, board games such as chess were not just entertainment, but also a way to demonstrate their intelligence and strategic skills. Dice games were popular among all classes, but they often led to gambling and conflicts. Music and dancing were also part of castle life, and minstrels often traveled from castle to castle, telling news and entertaining the public. Winter was the perfect time to share news and gossip, as well as to spend time chatting. Servants and soldiers, who worked from morning to night, had very little time for entertainment. Their leisure time often consisted of simply relaxing by the fire, if there was one, and exchanging stories. This was a way to take their minds off their hard work and the cold. They shared folk tales and songs that had been passed down from generation to generation. This not only helped them pass the long evenings, but also preserved their culture and traditions, which were very important in a time when there were no books or education. In winter, the castle became the center of social life. Tournaments and festivals were held for the nobility, but these were rare. Mostly they spent their time in the main hall, where they read aloud nightly novels or religious texts. These books were very expensive and few in number, so reading was a privilege. Simpler entertainment was available for servants and soldiers. They gathered in the barracks or in the kitchen, where they told each other stories, sang songs, and played simple games. Simple board games such as backgammon and Nine Men's Morris, which could be made by hand, were popular among the servants. They also engaged in crafts. They wove baskets, mended clothes, and carved figures out of wood. These activities not only helped pass the time, but were also useful for the household. We talk a lot about feudal lords and their conditions, but what about the servants? They lived in even harsher conditions. Their rooms were located in the coldest parts of the castle, often in basements or on the upper floors, where there were no fireplaces. They slept on straw mattresses and covered themselves with woolen blankets. Their food was even more meager than that of the feudal lords. And of course, they worked from morning to night, performing all the household duties. They carried water, chopped wood, and stoked the fires. At the same time, if they fell ill, no one came to their aid. They were forced to cope with their problems on their own. This was another factor that made winter in the castle a very dangerous time. The servants in the castle were not just workers. They were part of the castle, an integral part of it. But at the same time, they had no privileges. They lived in the worst conditions, worked until they were exhausted, and their lives were very hard. Their rooms were cold, damp, and dark. They had no way to keep warm except through their work. They were constantly on the move, which of course helped them maintain their body temperature. But when they stopped, they immediately felt the cold. And if they fell ill, it was a very serious problem. They had no access to a doctor, as he only served the feudal lord. They were forced to treat themselves using herbs and folk remedies. If the illness was serious, they would most likely just die. And of course, they had no hope that their lives would ever improve. They were forced to live as they did, and it was a very difficult ordeal. In addition to cold and damp rooms, servants often slept in common areas where there were many people, which contributed to the rapid spread of disease. Their mattresses made of straw were an ideal breeding ground for parasites. Their diet consisted mainly of black bread, porridge, and vegetable stews, and meat, if any, was only available in very small quantities. The servants' working day began at dawn and ended late at night, and they often had to perform very heavy physical work, such as lifting heavy buckets of water, chopping wood, and cleaning stables. As a result, they often suffered from injuries and overexertion. Medical care was unavailable to them, and they were forced to rely on their own strength and folk remedies. In such conditions, even a simple cold could be fatal, and a broken bone could leave a person disabled for life. The life of a servant was hard, and they had to fight for survival every day, their only hope being to live to see the next day. The servants' quarters, if they could be called that, were often located in the most inconvenient and cold places, on the upper floors, where the wind whistled through the cracks, in the basements, or even in the kitchen, where they could warm themselves with the residual heat. They slept huddled together, sharing one blanket between several people. The servants' clothes were made of the coarsest wool, often worn and torn, which made them unsuitable for protection against the cold. Their duties were not only hard, but also dangerous. They cleaned chimneys, which was very dirty and risky work, carried water up icy stairs, and watched the fires. The lack of any medical care meant that even a small cut could lead to infection and loss of working ability, which for servants was tantamount to a death sentence. Winter is a time when people get sick more often. In a castle where it was cold, damp, and there was no proper hygiene or food, diseases spread very quickly. Coughs, colds, fevers, and flu were all commonplace. Medicine in those days was very primitive. People believed in herbs, tinctures, and amulets. There might have been a doctor in the castle, but his knowledge was very limited. He could help with simple illnesses, but not with more serious ones. And of course, in conditions where there were no antibiotics, any cold could turn into a tragedy. Another important factor that contributed to the spread of disease was the lack of knowledge about the causes of disease. People believed that diseases were caused by evil spirits, bad air, or God's punishment. Therefore, they did nothing to prevent their spread. They did not wash their hands, disinfect rooms, or observe hygiene. And of course, this led to very serious consequences. When an epidemic broke out in a castle, it usually affected all the inhabitants, and many of them died. Doctors at that time, if there were any, could only alleviate the symptoms, but not cure the disease. They used herbs, tinctures, and poultices, but this, of course, did not help with serious illnesses. Therefore, people very often died from what we can now cure in a few days. And this was another factor that made winter in the castle a very dangerous time. Medical knowledge at the time was based on the humor theory, which assumed that diseases arise from an imbalance of 4 fluids in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors who were only available to the nobility tried to restore this balance through bloodletting, herbal remedies, and various poultices. However, these methods often did more harm than good, and many patients died not from the disease itself, but from improper treatment. Servants and soldiers who did not have access to doctors relied on folk remedies and herbalists who passed their knowledge down from generation to generation. They used herbs such as plantain and chamomile to treat wounds and colds. But these remedies were ineffective against serious infections. In cold, damp, and unsanitary conditions, even the simplest illnesses, such as the flu, could lead to death. Lack of proper hygiene, dirty water, and poor nutrition made people vulnerable to infections. And winter was a time when mortality rates rose sharply. The winter months were a time when colds, pneumonia, and frostbite were particularly common. Dampness and cold exacerbated chronic diseases, such as rheumatism and arthritis. The only protection against disease was a strong immune system and luck. There might have been an apothecary in the castle who prepared medicines from herbs, but his knowledge was very limited. He could help with a simple headache or indigestion, but not with an epidemic. People believed that diseases could be warded off with talismans and amulets, or that prayer could heal. Such superstitions were very common, as people could not explain the causes of diseases and had no way of curing them. How did people survive in such conditions? They had no choice. They adapted. They insulated their rooms by covering the walls with carpets and fabrics. They used hot water bottles and slept together to keep warm. They conserved fuel, water, and food. They worked to earn a living, and they believed that spring would eventually come. They spent time together telling each other stories, and that gave them strength. And of course, they were strong in spirit. They believed in themselves, they believed in their communities, and that helped them cope with the hardships. They were true heroes, and their story is one of the power of the human spirit. One important aspect of survival was mutual aid. The people who lived in the castle were part of one community. They helped each other, shared food, clothing, and experience. If someone got sick, everyone helped them. They were like one big family, and that, of course, helped them cope with the difficulties. Another important factor was the use of all the resources at their disposal. They did not throw anything away. Leftover food was fed to livestock, old clothes were resewn, and branches were used for firewood. They were very thrifty, and this, of course, helped them survive. They were also very resourceful. They came up with new ways to keep warm, preserve food, and entertain themselves. This, of course, helped them cope with the difficulties. Inventiveness and resourcefulness were the keys to survival. People insulated not only the walls but also the windows, covering them with animal skins or oiled cloth. They created simple but effective heaters using heated stones or even hot coals wrapped in rags. To preserve food, they used not only salt and smoking, but also air drying and fermentation, creating sauerkraut, pickles, and other preserves. Social ties were incredibly important. Collective work in gathering firewood, repairing walls, or caring for the sick brought people together and gave them hope. The belief that spring would come was a powerful psychological anchor. On long winter evenings gathered around the hearth, they not only entertained themselves but also passed on important knowledge, experience, and stories that helped them survive. These stories served as a reminder that they were part of something bigger and that they would survive this time, just like their ancestors. One important aspect of survival was teamwork. In winter, everyone in the castle, from the feudal lord to the servants, came together to solve common problems. They organized collective hunting and fishing trips to obtain fresh food and shared resources. Mutual assistance was not just a moral principle, but a necessity for survival. Each member of the community had their own role, and everyone depended on each other. This interdependence created strong social bonds and helped overcome difficulties. Life in the castle was cyclical, and people believed that winter was only a temporary trial. And the stories they passed down from generation to generation were proof that they would survive this winter too. We can see that life in a medieval castle in winter was very harsh and difficult. It was a constant struggle against the cold, hunger, and disease. We are used to seeing castles as symbols of luxury, but in reality, they were places where people survived. It seems impossible to us, but they managed. And this makes us wonder how many more myths about the past we have yet to debunk. What historical topics would you be interested in learning about in future episodes? Leave your ideas in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos.